At the end of the day, what I find, if you don't have viable financial institutions, you put everything at risk. And what's happening, at least in Florida, I'm sure around the country, a lot of these banks that are leveraged 10 to 1, they, because they've been taking such a hit to their equity, they've had to shrink all the banks. So not only do you affect the companies that are trying to create jobs, but you affect a lot of good companies where they come in and they scoop all their equity. And that's why it's so critical that, in my experience, you've got to have sound financial institutions. And if you go back 100 years, we get in this trap every 10 or 15 years. So, Mr. Johnson, do you agree that we've got to take a look at the viability long-term of financial institutions in terms as it relates to especially small businesses? It's nice to talk about equity, but it's hard to get equity for small business, and they're the job creators.
Absolutely, Mr. Buchanan. If you go back to when we had a real free market system around finance in this country more than 100 years ago, before deposit insurance, before the Federal Reserve was created, banks at that time routinely had 30% equity, no risk adjustment in that calculation, 30% equity relative to their total assets, and they had big buffers against losses. And when you had a downturn, they didn't have to cancel all their other loans, all their good loans. They didn't squeeze out the small businesses. We can't go back to a system without deposit insurance, unfortunately. We have to recognize that regulation has encouraged and allowed banks to have too little capital for too long. If we're going to have big shocks in our economy going forward, you need to be discouraging debt and encouraging equity in the heart of the financial system, including big banks and small community banks.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan.